Last time we spoke, I asked you, if you were Toto Wolff, how would you address the dynamic between Messrs Russell and Lewis? And at that point, you put out a rather viral soundbite and said that you would tear up George Russell's contract, and you'd say to him that you'd never overtake Lewis Hamilton again. Sign here. I'm gonna pitch that. I'm gonna pitch that question at you again. Nearly 12 months later, you're Toto Wolff. How do you address the bubbling acrimony between Messrs Russell and Hamilton?
I don't think you can blame George for any of this. I think George is a simple, not simple, it's the wrong word. He's a very basic, fast, aggressive racing driver. And he knows that throughout his time at Mercedes with Lewis in the other car, the only thing he has to do is beat Lewis. And he's always going to look good. He's got to out-qualify Lewis and preferably outscore him in every race. That's all he's got to do, and run in front of him. Doesn't really matter where they are. From George's point of view, of course he'd love to be winning Grand Prix, but that's not the thing for him. The thing for him is to be beating Lewis. From Lewis's point of view, completely different perspective. He doesn't need any drama from some young guy blowing him off by a 10th here or a 10th there. All he wants to do is win Grand Prix and be back where he belongs, racing with Max Verstappen at the front and preferably beating Max. That's the only thing Lewis is thinking about on a daily basis. So they've got completely different perspectives. And again, was that taken into account when they signed George to replace Valtteri?
Mr. Windsor, the legend that is. How are you doing, sir? GOAT broadcaster, looking very well, sir.
Goat, as in I'm an old goat. Yeah, I think that's about right. I know what you mean, but they're far too kind. No, lovely. Sitting here in the sun out the back of the villa and blue sky. Got the shades on. Might take them off after a bit, but yeah, really good. Singapore. I didn't do Japan, so Singapore was good. A bit of a rush trip but the good news is with Singapore in a way that you have to keep European time zone, so it's not too big an adjustment when you get back. So yeah, good.
How did you take in Singapore, just quickly before we get onto the most up-to-date Suzuka? Because it was an interesting one with Red Bull's underperformance there, and lots of theories being bandied around the potential causes of that, Peter.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I've said before on these chats with you that throughout my career, if that's the right word, I've always kind of gone against the mainstream. It's just sort of a thing. It's not that I want to be against the mainstream. It's just that I try not to let what everybody else is talking about, the sort of general clatter, excuse me, it's not the tripod, affect the way I think. Because my excuse is I don't think my brain is big enough to take all that stuff in and read what everybody else is saying. So I just try to keep my own focus based on my own understanding of Formula One. And so far as I was concerned in Singapore, I was in a relatively isolated bubble with Jackie Stewart, with the Rolex guests, working with Jackie all weekend, and equally going down to the paddock periodically when I had the odd moment and chatting to a few mates. And for me, hermetically sealed, it was always clear that it was nothing to do with the technical directive, and it was definitely a setup issue, which we've seen Red Bull in trouble with before, notably in Brazil last year, obviously, when the sprint race format didn't allow them to get out of it. And here it was always going to be interesting to see how they got the car set up before qualifying, in other words, into Parc Ferme. And they did a pretty good job, I think. And the car, I'm not sure how many people gave them credit in the race for having a pretty well-balanced high-grip car, but they did have that. What they didn't have, I don't think, was still perfect up and down shifts. I think the seamless shift was still giving a few dramas, but I think they took off quite a lot of the the gear braking out of the car, which is possibly, but where Max was in traffic, it didn't make that much difference. So that was always what I thought. And then when I got down to the paddock and I started chatting to a few people, and a few journalists were chatting, came up and said hi. And they were all saying, oh no, the FIA have really done it now. They've really changed Formula One. Red Bull are in massive trouble. They've been cheating. And I just looked at them. I thought, are we on the same planet Earth or what? This is, and as a, I'm not saying beating the chest saying I was right, but I mean, I was right. And I wasn't the only person, obviously. I think most of the Formula One team people, even Red Bull's opposition, were all saying, nah, it's not a technical directive. No way in the world. I think anyone who really understands Formula One would have known that. And going to Suzuka, it was always going to be pretty clear that Red Bull were going to be right there. I think the other interesting thing about Singapore was how Carlos nailed it. And Charles was again in sort of that struggle mode all weekend.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was something we've seen over the last 4 or 5 races. And part of that is Carlos has found this beautiful groove and this beautiful slot in which he now lives, which is the fulfillment of the talent that he has to the utmost extreme, minimizing the errors. And the minimizing the errors is quite a big thing, because the way he drives, he's always going to be slightly more exposed to an inside front lockup, or maybe braking a little bit too late with the rears locking or whatever. And he's managed to find just the envelope inside that and make it really work. And all credit to him for that. And I've been talking about that all year, really. I mean, I think since Melbourne, he's been really good. And I think what he went through at Melbourne, and a lot of people were sort of didn't really give that too much notice, I think. But what he went through, what he was put through in Melbourne with that penalty was absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. And I think the way he came out of that took him a couple of weeks, but the way he came out of that, he came out of a different guy after that. And he's really good now. So Charles had to up his game. Well, let me rephrase that. I don't think he has. I'm rambling on now, but I don't think Charles had to up his game. I think what Charles had to do is reboot, because he was getting to the point where it was getting impossible, really, to continue the way he was. His all his inputs were starting to become spikier. He was making more mistakes more frequently. He was more on edge. He was getting too emotional, and it was all reversed. And I think it's kind of fortunate that the next race after Singapore was Suzuka, because Suzuka is a circuit where Charles, even if he puts his brain in neutral, is by default going to be mega good. He's never going to be slow up the hill at Suzuka. He's never going to be slow into 1A, 1B. He's never going to be bad into Degner. And he's always going to be good into Spoon. And if you're good there, you've nailed Suzuka. And that's where I think Charles, after about 5 laps of FP1, really started to feel, I'm a racing driver again, and I can be me. And that's what we saw at the weekend. I don't think Carlos did a bad job, but I think we saw a Charles that we haven't seen for the last 5 or 6 races. And it was Suzuka that brought it out of him. If the next race had been, I don't know, Austin, I'm not sure, or Qatar, even worse. I think Carlos might have continued with the momentum, but because it was Suzuka, it was always going to be Leclerc. So they were the 2 really interesting things for me. And it's good to see Red Bull just doing what they did, because I love to see perfection, and I think we all do. I hope we all do.
So go on then. You've addressed Carlos Sainz quite succinctly there, and I've got to confess and be open and transparent. I feel like I've been a bit harsh about Carlos Sainz Jr. Not so much his driving, but his racing brain. We all knew that he was more assertive than Charles Leclerc, but that trick that he pulled with Lando Norris, pulling him along with the DRS, Peter, that's proper stuff, isn't it? The ability to calculate that in real time and work out that his best chance of staying ahead of the 2 charging Mercedes was to almost tag team it with Lando. That's proper Alain Prost level stuff, isn't it, Peter, really?
It is kind of. I mean, I didn't notice that at the time. And here I have to put my hand up and say probably I was an ignoramus at that point, because I'm not massively into DRS and understanding how DRS works and what you can do with it. And still, when I think about what you've just said and what Carlos said, they're using my trick from Singapore. I'm not sure it's a trick that many drivers would want to reproduce or indeed keep in their repertoire, because what you're doing is basically allowing the guy behind to get nearer than you'd want him to be. And okay, it was Lando Norris, and he always felt confident, I guess, with the top speed of the Ferrari, even when Lando was in the DRS, that he was going to be okay. But it's very thin ice you're skating on with that. And I don't see that as quite the sort of, as you just described, I don't see it as that. I think it was probably at the moment, at that time, in that night, it was probably quite a cool thing to do. But, you're playing with fire, aren't you, doing that?
Risky. Very, very risky.
If you're a Charles Leclerc or a Jackie Stewart or a Jim Clark or a Max Verstappen or a Michael Schumacher, you would think, just get away from these guys. You wouldn't think, oh, I'll let this guy sit in my DRS and protect me or something. I think that's, it's overcomplicating racing in my view.
Yeah.
Maybe just my brain. What can I say?
Yeah.
But going back to Carlos, I think you talked about his personality, and you mentioned the word junior there. I think a lot of credit should go to Senior, because Senior is the ultimate competitor, isn't he? He's super aggressive, but at the same time, he's got this maturity and this ability to think of the last lap on the first lap in terms of a rally or a rally, extreme rally or whatever it is. And I think his father's had an enormous effect on the way Carlos Jr. has developed over the last 4 to 5 years. And it's not for nothing that they're still a very closely knit family in Madrid. And I think that says a lot too. There's none of this sort of, basking in the sun in Monaco. It's basking in the sun in Madrid, but you know where I'm at. It's not that sort of stuff where it's very easy, I imagine, not that I've done that life, but lived that life, but it's easy to imagine on a Monaco on a Tuesday after a Grand Prix, you sort of cruise along by the marina and, oh, look, there's one of my mates, George Russell, having breakfast, and, and everybody lives in another world, and you don't actually become as self-critical probably as you would if you're sitting down with breakfast in front of your mum and dad, and your dad's saying, so what were you doing? What were you thinking? And it's a different world, isn't it? And I all credit to Carlos for that.
Yeah, I think he might be the de facto number one at the moment at Scuderia Ferrari. Although I love Charles Leclerc, and he's the quicker in absolute terms of the two. But I think Carlos is he nearly there in Frederick Vasseur's?
Well, I think, as I say, I think Charles Leclerc got back to where he would normally be in Suzuka. So I don't think he's a de facto number one. I think Charles on that flight back from Japan would be thinking, yeah, okay, back to where we should be now. And Carlos is probably thinking, yeah, Charles had me this weekend, and that's okay. That's how it's a very well balanced team. As I said in my video, a lot of this is about how you have two teammates who don't necessarily have to be mates or work well together, but the disparity between them in terms of pace needs to be able to work well for the faster of the two drivers. And yes, there have been occasions this year, several occasions where Carlos has been the quicker driver, but I still think that's a very nicely balanced team because of the two talents and styles of the drivers. Much better balanced team than George Russell, Lewis Hamilton, or indeed Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri.
Oh, Peter, it's very complicated over there at Mercedes. Finally, on Carlos Sainz Jr. I just want to I want to ask you. I've heard a lot from my Spanish friends that there is a bit of friction, let's say, between former pals Carlos Sainz and Fernando Alonso as far as who is the Spanish mini media darling of F1, that Carlos Sainz wants to be that, but he's not yet there because Fernando is still kind of the Spanish media's darling. What are you seeing in real time, Peter, since you're there, right? That's where you're based out of at the moment.
Well, what I heard, admittedly only through third parties, was that nothing to do with the media and who wants to be the Spanish darling, but just literally between the two of them, there was a bit of a falling out earlier this year. We're talking sort of March, April time, maybe even earlier. And I have no idea what that was over. Maybe it was over some sponsor that one of them was talking to that went to the other driver or something like that. Maybe, I've no idea, but they fell out in the sense that they used to be very close. Carlos saw Fernando as his mentor sort of thing. And I think Fernando saw in Carlos a guy that he really liked with the rallying and everything else, and his dad, and it will all work well. But I think they did have a falling out over something at the beginning of this year. And I think in general in Spain, there's a tendency for the Spanish and the media to gravitate towards Fernando, partly because he's been around longer and partly because he's this renegade who's out there, swashbuckling and does what he does in a very open way, whereas Carlos Sainz is a bit more refined and a bit quieter, I suppose. And even, albeit unbelievably cool guy in terms of being a Ferrari Formula One driver, you would imagine he would be absolutely ginormous. So I think it's more that. I think it's the media no different in Spain to the rest of the world. They go for the sort of lowest common denominator, easiest thing to do. It's easier to write a negative story about Lewis than to go on about the intricacies of the driving style differences between George Russell and Lando Norris, isn't it? So it's the same way, it's easier to do a big Fernando thing, whatever it is, why are Aston Martin letting Fernando down or whatever they want to do. It's easier to do that than Carlos Sainz's is mega. And so that's the story they go for. And I just think it's standard journalistic rubbish. Right? Well, I shouldn't say rubbish. Isn't it?
The low-hanging journalistic tropes.
Yeah.
Fair.
I think it also depends on what we all perceive to be the prevailing opinion as well, whether the prevailing opinion is that defined by the daily press or what you read on your headlines with your motorsport orientated websites, or whether it's reality. And a lot of people don't have the time actually to see what reality is all about, so they just take these other elements and believe them, I guess. And that's one of the problems with having media so accessible these days and so widespread.
Peter, do you find yourself a bit disenchanted with that, the rumour versus reality disconnect as far as F1 media is concerned? Because I imagine, I mean, you've got direct links to, I mean, you were talking to Adrian Newey about the TD018, right? So you can kind of verify it firsthand almost. But do you kind of read the rumour and the articles and just be like, oh God, that's another clickbaity article, and I can't be bothered with that at all. Misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think the problem is the way information is presented. It's presented as if this is the gospel truth and you must believe us because we are the world's experts. That's basically that's the tone in which a lot of the articles, not only in Formula One, but around the world about many subjects, are written. And the problem is when people read that, they tend to think, oh, well, that's it, that's fact. And it struck me, and a good example of that was, I hadn't really been aware of this either because I don't troll the internet very much from a Formula One perspective. But apparently quite a lot of people have been saying that Aston Martin's drop-off in speed has been due to another technical directive which enforced them to strengthen their flexi wings. And a lot of people were saying, well, that's what happened with Aston Martin, so that's what must now be happening with Red Bull. And yet I was talking to the Aston Martin people in Singapore that I know, off the record, obviously. And I said, presumably you guys have gone through that. I said, what do you mean? I said, well, I don't know. I've been reading that apparently you guys have had to strengthen up your wings and that's why you've lost a bit of pace. The guy said, it's complete and utter rubbish. He said, and then he said to me, the more rubbish you feed into the media machine, the worse the rubbish that comes out the other end. And so people start believing it. And he said, there is absolutely no truth whatsoever in that. Aston Martin have lost their way in other areas. It could well be upgrades haven't worked, whatever it is. But it's nothing to do with strengthening the wings and technical directive. So, I think that's the problem, isn't it? And do I find that frustrating? I find it, absolutely. If you look at the polarization of websites and news coverage, just in American politics, just to take one example, if you only watch Fox News, you'd have a completely different view of the world to only watching, I don't know, MSNBC. And so what is the truth? I think as human beings, the onus is on us actually to find the balance. And sadly, as I say, I don't think either many people have the time or the inclination to do that. They just like to take what they're given and have it force fed.
Oh, Peter, this is this is so true. I don't know. This is chaos. There's a responsibility on the consumer now that there previously wasn't to view and ingest all of their media, F1 or otherwise, with
I think so.
a somewhat discerning guy.
I think there is, and I think, and of course, a lot of people don't have time for that because there's so much media, and the media is so vast. And how do you do that? I mean, again, if you take the other end of the spectrum, if you look at what the teams and the governing body, Liberty, put out in terms of their press releases and the information and the way they want people to think about racing. If you read the Mercedes post-race media stuff from Japan, it was as if there was no infighting at all between George and Lewis, and they'd all had great races and everybody was wonderful. And there was no mention of anything. And I was thinking about that. Well, why is that? Oh, well, because probably the teams are doing those press releases. They have to do them. I think it's a regulation they have to do them. But beyond that, they're probably thinking more of their partners and stakeholders than they are actually of, putting out anything that's remotely near reality. And they're obviously, it's their own thing and they can do whatever they like and they can present it in any way they want. But that is an example of how people, I think, can be led down a specific path. And obviously Mercedes are going to have a huge platform in which to say that, because that's very different from where Formula One was before the age of, should we say, before the age of the internet, when the teams were dependent on the media for the sort of exposure they wanted to have. And it was a very different world, and the media played a completely different role. Now it's a sort of subsidiary role. And if you don't want to play the game, go away, we won't cooperate with you at all, sort of thing. And that's sad, isn't it? I mean, I think that is sad, because ultimately it's only the media that can give you what we just described, can give you the reality of the balanced picture. It's getting a bit of sun here, so I might just go back a bit into the shade again. It's
no worries.
It's just the picture that I'm thinking about, because it's going to be better if I don't have the glare, I think. There we go.
Perfect.
So that's it. And I think, I can remember saying to Frank Williams when I was there, I said, Frank, the time will come when, due to technology, Williams will be in a position to have effectively our own TV channel, and basically be able to do what we want on that channel and present the team in the way we want. And Frank, I remember him saying, we'll never do that. That's a complete waste of time. Only because I think in his mind, he could see sort of bells ringing of how much that was going to cost. And if it was 1 cent going on PR and media that could be spent on the race team, he was never going to sign it off. That was Frank, bless him. But we are there now. Effectively the teams. I think Matt Bishop should take a lot of credit for that, if that's the right word. Or we should blame Matt for when he was at McLaren, for setting up that amazing media platform that McLaren have, which all the other teams have now emulated. And so what, it's a big question, is what is the role of the media now? What is the role of the media? And it's a really interesting point, because if there was no media in there doing supposedly objective stuff, would Formula One be any worse? Probably not, because most of the people go to the teams, do they not, for their information? I don't know. I don't know. Again, I'm rambling a bit, but it was interesting. I think the 3-day attendance of the Japanese Grand Prix was 222,000 over 3 days.
Wow.
And I suspect quite a lot of those 222,000 went for more than just 1 day. A lot of them stayed for 3 days, and many of them stayed for the weekend. A lot of camping at Suzuka. So let's assume there's a lot of people who are in there twice, if you like. And my viewership for the 3 days was 215,000.
Wow.
And none of those people went to Japan, I guess. Equally, a lot of them watched more than once, twice, maybe watched all 3 videos. I don't know. But it's about the same overlap as you'd get from spectators. So it's an interesting number, isn't it? I'm not quite sure what it means, but there's, around the world, there's 222,000 people, which is about the same number that actually watch a physical Grand Prix, watching me ramble on for a long video, much longer than it should be on YouTube, and actually watching the whole thing, or most of it, wanting my opinion and sort of some sort of objective view of what's happening. A lot of people probably don't think I'm objective, but I try to be. And so there is a role, I guess, for the media, but I'm not quite sure what it is anymore. I'm a bit confused.
It's changing, right, Peter? And media, the definition of what it means to be media is changing in and of itself, right? So I don't know. This is all to pin it down and point these things at neatly pigeonholed definitions, I think is almost fool's gold in 2023.
Well,
Peter.
And I think also, and I think you're right, there's little definitions, and I think there's this sort of thing about having to have a grabbing headline for whatever it is, a video, a web story. It has to be
100%.
Has to be this, as short as possible, but has to have certain words in it that are going to attract people. And that, that is ridiculously juvenile, isn't it, really? If you think about it, it's just pathetic. I mean, if it was a kindergarten, you just about get away with that. But we're supposed to be adults, and that's why I've given up on that. And I just call it, 2023 Japanese Grand Prix race analysis. goodbye. I'm not going to go down that path. It's just, juvenile is the only word I can think of that, that sort of, secrets behind Max this or whatever. And occasionally I do that and I just think, no, forget that. Doesn't feel right.
I don't hate it, Peter. Go on then, Peter. Let's talk about Suzuka because it was an incredible Grand Prix. Let's go in chronological order. Talk to me about Max Verstappen's qualifying lap and Sector 1 in particular. You call them A1 and 1A and 1B. How good was that lap that Max Verstappen pulled together? Because I keep hearing.
I mean, you can see the importance of the first sector. A, it's a long sector, but B, that's where his big advantage was. He also had advantages in sectors 2 and 3. I think he put on a little bit of front flap for that second run, and despite that, he still managed to get an improvement on sectors 2 and 3 when there are quite significant straights. I think that was the first thing that was really impressive about that lap. Secondly, obviously that margin he had in sector 1. And actually, if you think about it, I think what makes that such a great bit of Formula One road is that what you do at the top of the hill at the S's, as you're basically getting on the power to go through Dunlop at the top of the hill, the flat out left-hander, but you want to be carrying as little load there as possible and not asking any more of the car than you need to be asking, because there's a bit of a straight there before the Degners. What you're doing at the top of the hill there is actually defined by how you go into 1A. And that's how significant that entire part is. So 1A, 1B is actually part of the S's. You can't take it in its isolation, because if you come out of 1B absolutely nailing it, you've got too much load then to get the car perfectly rotated and set up for the entry to the S's. And if you haven't got it perfect going into the S's, that penalty is going to be taking you all the way up the hill. And that's what makes it such a great bit of road. And you can see, obviously you can see Max earlier turn in than most going into 1A, as you could with Lewis, as you could with Oscar compared with Lando, as you could with Charles compared with Carlos. But it wasn't just shortening the corner there. That is a driver he's almost thinking of Dunlop as he's going into 1A at the bottom of the hill. And that's what made that lap so good to me. And if you look at his exit from 1B, yes, he's using all the road, but he's not crunching the car. He's not got massive load on exit. You can see he's already balancing the car for a perfect transition into the S's. And that's what made that lap so beautiful. You could see that. It was that sort of millisecond of the feeling you get when a great driver is in the middle of a corner, being very patient, waiting for the perfect rotation moment, and some idiotic engineers on the radio saying, "Oh, your minimum speed's too low," and you're saying, and the driver just wants to say, "Get off the airwaves! I know what I'm doing." And we had that. We actually had that with Oscar. I think at one point the engineer got on the radio to Oscar. I think it was the second Degner. I think it's turn 9, and he said, "Oh, you could sharpen up your minimum speed in 9." I think it was in the race actually, to Oscar. And I remember thinking, it's a good job Oscar's very, very laid-back Aussie, and it's a good job that he's got the ability for that to go one ear and straight out the other, because it's probably that low minimum speed in the middle of 9 that made Oscar so good in sector 2 in Suzuka, because it's absolutely nothing to be gained by having a high minimum speed in turn 9 at Suzuka. It's all about the exit and the rotation of the car, getting it straight and getting it right. That's what makes Suzuka such a great circuit.
Brilliant.
And there was absolutely no way in the world Sergio Perez was going to be able to live with Max around Suzuka. Maybe on one lap with mega soft tires, perfect front flap, all the rest of it, he was going to get within a couple of tenths. But the odds of him doing that without making a mistake were very, very small, in my view. And kind of how it turned out.
It's a proper driver's track. Is Suzuka, right? I was astounded by I don't know if I'd go with Karun saying it was one of the greatest qualifying laps he'd ever seen, but sector 1 in particular, Peter, felt, when Senna's talking about this out of body experience when it's almost like the car's driving itself. That's kind of what I got from watching the onboard of Max in sector 1. I was just like, this
I
is
think
perfection.
so. I actually got more out of it watching the camera remove shots. I wasn't able to get exactly the feel on the onboard. It was more looking at how he was positioning the car, and the rear shot out of 1B. That was spine chilling for me. How good he was there, and from that moment, it was pretty clear that he was going to nail it. Just from that one exit point from 1B, turn 2, as everybody else likes to call it.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting point with that whole business of turn 1, turn 2. At what point does turn 1 become turn 2 in the minds of the people who think that it is turn 2? I mean, it's not as if the cars are standing still doing nothing between 1 and 1B. I mean, it's a very, very misleading nomenclature that the FIA have for that, I think.
It's a moving target.
It's like calling that kink on the straight between turns 1 and 3 in Austria a corner as well. What's that all about?
Yeah, it's a bit misleading.
But I tell you, there's some great overtaking at Suzuka, and I think a lot of that is because of Suzuka and the quality of the circuit there. And in no particular order. Obviously, Oscar's pass on George on the outside, and I think Carlos Sainz on Fernando, who we were talking about earlier, going into Spoon. I mean, you don't often see a guy around the outside of that kink before Spoon. And there was Carlos doing that.
Incredible.
Brilliant. Great stuff.
I loved it. I wish we could go to Suzuka every race weekend, Peter. It'd be incredible. Talk to me about the Mercedes.
Bear in mind, it was designed as a test track for Honda.
I remember you said, and you shouted out the guy who designed it, right?
Yeah, well, John Hugenholtz, because he'd done a good job with Zandvoort, Honda quite correctly said, we must get John Hugenholtz from Zandvoort to come over and design our test track. So he designed that. And here we are, 2023. We're all saying it's the best Grand Prix circuit in the world. And he designed it in 62. What does that tell you?
Wow, that we've gone backwards, Peter. But hey.
You said it, not I.
Just a tad. Go on then, Peter. Let's talk about the Mercedes pairing, because last time we spoke, I asked you, if you were Toto Wolff, how would you address the dynamic between Messrs Russell and Lewis? And at that point, you put out a rather viral soundbite and said that you would tear up George Russell's contract, and you'd say to him that you'd never overtake Lewis Hamilton again. Sign here. I'm gonna pitch that. I'm gonna pitch that question at you again. Nearly 12 months later, you're Toto Wolff. How do you address the bubbling acrimony between Messrs Russell and Hamilton? Because they need to address it forthwith, don't they? They need to do it soonish.
Well, I mean, they need to address it forthwith on the assumption they're going to have a quick car in 2024. I mean, that's a huge assumption to make, of course. So if they continue to have the thing they have now, should I call it a Formula One car? Yeah, I guess so. Then it doesn't really matter, does it? It doesn't really matter if they're fighting and there's fur flying and it's all for 5th place. Does it really matter? But obviously, if they have everything I've said about Mercedes should always be seen in the context of my precursor, which is if they have a Grand Prix winning car and a World Championship, therefore potentially winning car, there is a major problem that Mercedes have to face, and that is Lewis Hamilton versus George Russell. And it'll be a negative effect on the team because they'll be taking points from one another, and B, they'll potentially be DNFs because of what's going on. And I don't know. I mean, the minute Toto decided not to listen to Lewis and got rid of Valtteri and signed George, then there was really no solution to the problem, because we all know how quick George is and how aggressive he is. And there's no way Lewis wanted to keep Valtteri just because he wanted a guy he could beat, because Valtteri had beaten Lewis on occasion. He'd driven pretty well. It was more, this is a guy I know who isn't going to cramp my style. And the problem is it's now cramping, and has been cramping, Lewis's style for quite a long time. I mean, when Lewis says, as he said on a Friday after FP2 in Suzuka, I just don't feel at one with the car, but George got in a much better lap today, so I hope I can support him in the... And then he sort of stopped himself, and he was just like, what am I saying here? It's almost, that is not getting the best from Lewis Hamilton. And I just don't think there's enough, as much as they talk about, I don't know what to say, really. I mean, the media are partly to blame, aren't they? The media have been saying the role is very weird, but I mean, the media and so-called fans who read the media, all clamoring to have the best possible, fastest driver in the other car, and George is quicker than Valtteri, therefore he must be the right guy. I presume all the Mercedes board that helped Toto sign off on that deal were reading all that stuff and agreed with them. I mean, it was complete nonsense, of course. And it's never, if you've got a Lewis, you never want to cramp his style with a George. If you've got a Michael Schumacher, you don't put Mika Hakkinen alongside him. If you've got Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart says no to Colin Chapman. You know, it's logical. If you've got Max Verstappen, you don't want George Russell in the car. You put Sergio Perez in the car. Red Bull know what they're doing. And you know, there is no solution to the problem now, actually, because it's gone too far. And it will be a problem, absolutely for sure. If the quicker that car gets, and in theory, I say the more competitive that car gets relative to its opposition, the worse the problem's going to get.
Oh dear, Peter, that's a damning prognostic.
Yeah. This Spanish sun moves unbelievably quickly.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
More shade here.
I always struggle with my son leaving.
Yeah.
It's a damning prognostic, Peter. That's and it concerns me as a Lewis Hamilton fan. It does concern me, especially there's something going on there, Peter, that I don't hear talked about a lot. And Lewis Hamilton fans around the world have been really angry at what they feel that I think primarily the radio messages from George. It's almost like he's demanding more of the team than his station requires, right? Like he's always on the radio and he's always kind of chuntering and kind of trying to exercise influence over the strategic decision making. And I think that's fine, Peter. You put on two caps, don't you? One is as a selfish F1 driver, selfishness being a prerequisite, of course, to being an F1 driver. But the second is, well, if you're quicker, then what's all the chatter for, George? And I don't know which one of those caps I wear. I don't know which one of those is right for this circumstance, whether George is moaning and trying to be almost a bit skullduggerous, or whether George is just an F1 racing driver trying to get 25 points over the course of a race weekend, right? I'm not sure which of the two, or maybe both can be true.
Well, I think George is a very clear-cut, basic, unbelievably competitive racing driver. And what we're seeing from George is absolutely nothing new. He was like that at Williams. So nobody should be surprised that George is asserting himself the way he is and has, because that's his character. I don't think I'm a Lewis fan. I've loved watching Lewis drive and I totally respect everything he's ever done. But I think right now you'd probably have to say, over one lap at most circuits, George is probably a fraction quicker than Lewis. And that's the problem. That's what I keep saying. That is the problem. And you don't solve that problem by hiring a George Russell, who's going to come in and blow Lewis away. You solve that problem by getting the best from Lewis. And we all know how good Lewis can be still, and how good his brain is, his racing brain, and how well he can pace a race and look after the tires and manage the tires, as we saw in Singapore. Recent example. And because Toto took the decision with Lewis potentially in the back end of his career, maybe losing a tenth or two, to hire this guy that was going to make up for those couple of tenths, the whole thing's a mess. That should never have happened. What should have happened is that Lewis should be in a position where they're getting the absolute best from him as a racing driver in every respect. And that doesn't mean cramping his style with a young kid who's going to be a tenth quicker periodically, or quite often. And when you've got one driver who's slightly quicker and the other driver who's slightly or excessively more mature and considerably more mature and able to put a race together, you've got a really difficult balance to solve. Very difficult balance. I don't think you can blame George for any of this. I think George is not simple is the wrong word. He's a very basic, fast, aggressive racing driver. And he knows that throughout his time at Mercedes with Lewis in the other car, the only thing he has to do is beat Lewis. And he's always going to look good. He's got to out-qualify Lewis and preferably outscore him in every race. That's all he's got to do, and run in front of him. Doesn't really matter where they are. From George's point of view, of course he'd love to be winning Grand Prix. But that's not the thing for him. The thing for him is to be beating Lewis. From Lewis's point of view, completely different perspective. He doesn't need any drama from some young guy blowing him off by a 10th here or a 10th there. All he wants to do is win Grand Prix, be back where he belongs, racing with Max Verstappen at the front and preferably beating Max. That's the only thing Lewis is thinking about on a daily basis. So they've got completely different perspectives. And again, was that taken into account when they signed George to replace Valtteri? If you think about it now, if Valtteri had been in that Mercedes all this time, I think things would have gone just about the same, maybe slightly better in a couple of areas. Maybe Lewis would have got more out of the car, the engineers, everything else. I don't know. Hard to say, but I don't think it would have been any worse, that's for sure.
Oh, Peter, this is it saddens me, this situation at Mercedes. And you said a brilliant thing on your latest live stream that I hadn't considered hitherto, that Mercedes is almost the anti-Red Bull in the way that they conduct their business activities, right? I think the term that you use is that they're blue chip, and that the George Russell hyper-attacking mode doesn't necessarily align well with that very conservative, rule of engagement driven conservative business ethos, right?
Yeah, as proven by the stuff that came out of the race. There was no mention of any of that aggro, and it was all, we did the best we could today, or we didn't get the setup right, whatever they were, talking about, and this and that. And yeah, of course, the Mercedes board don't want all that. If mind you, if Sergio Perez at Red Bull starts saying, "Oh, I'm getting inferior equipment, and I should be winning races," Red Bull's a sort of team where you can kind of live with that, and it kind of goes with the furniture, doesn't it? But Mercedes, they've got on this one side this reality of this friction, which is a physical friction of their own making in replacing Valtteri with George. And on the other side of the coin, they've got this sort of blue chip, whiter than white image of, well, yeah, Lewis got, have you still got me?
I know you've dropped off, Peter. Oh, there you go. You come back.
Sorry. You still got, on the other side of the coin, you've got this, what's going on? Okay, you got me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. On the other side of the coin, you've got, Lewis being treated probably worse than any driver in the history of the sport at the back end of 2021 in terms of an FIA decision that was completely in breach of the regulations and therefore losing in the World Championship. And Mercedes quite early on into the winter basically giving up the fight and saying, oh, for the good of the sport and moving on, we'll call it quits and congratulations, Max, you're the new world champion. And okay, if you're going to have that image, why have you got two drivers squabbling now? You can't have both. And to me, it's very strange how it's going at the moment.
There's inconsistency in there, isn't there, Peter? But hey, I digress. Enough Mercedes slander from me. Let's talk about something more positive. Your compatriot Oscar Piastri, mate. How good can this chap be, Peter? A lot of people are saying already that his uppermost, his potential ceiling could in a couple of years be higher than his current teammate Lando Norris. Is that how highly you rate Oscar on the back of his brilliant rookie season?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's got shorter corners than Lando, and I think he's a little bit more self-critical in terms of his driving technique than Lando, possibly because it's his rookie season and he's therefore trying to learn everything he can. But the reality is there aren't many drivers these days that go around watching other drivers and learning from them, and that he does watch Max very closely and learn from him, I think is an incredibly positive thing. And beyond that, he's got everything. He's got short corners, he's got lovely touch, and he's got a very calm, cool demeanor with seemingly no side at the moment. Obviously, it's quite early stages of his career, but it seems as if he's able to take whatever he's given and just swallow it and accept it and be very cool about it. And that's going to stand him in unbelievably strong stead going forward. So, yeah, I would say that. I think the problem is that already the performance of Oscar and the quality of Oscar's driving is already probably having a bit of a negative effect on Lando, because he's starting to have to focus, as I predicted at the start of the year, on making sure he's ahead of Oscar everywhere and being the experienced McLaren team leader. But, that's not easy. It's not easy, particularly if your corners are a little bit longer than Oscar's. And on any given lap, Oscar's going to be using less road and actually perhaps using the tyres slightly less as well for the same lap time. And I've always said from day one that was a problem. And again, it comes down to the Mercedes thing. If you've got Lando and you really believe in Lando as a potential world champion, and I think, of course, Lando's got the talent not only to win Grand Prix, but to win world championship. Absolutely, it goes without saying. If you believe that, you don't replace Daniel Ricciardo with Oscar Piastri. You leave him with Daniel Ricciardo. Great team, well-balanced team. Perfect team for Lando to develop and progress as a driver. But the more as time goes on now, the less Lando, I think, is going to develop because of the pressure from Oscar. And I think it's a very easy cliche to say in Formula One, in any form of motorsport, the other guy's really quick, he'll push Lando to go faster. That's not the point. The point is for Lando to drive well, not to go faster. And that isn't going to happen just by Oscar Piastri getting in the car and going 0.2 quicker. That's for sure. So again, it's a little bit like the Mercedes situation. And if McLaren, for example, had a car that was as dominant as the Red Bull next year, there will be definite fireworks between Lando and Oscar as well. But I would predict Oscar would come out better from those two.
Oh, wow. That's bonkers. But I rate Lando very highly. So
I do too. I've always rated Lando since Formula 3. Good. I think he's incredibly fluid, smooth, well-balanced racing driver. He's everything. But I've said for at least 3 years now that he needs to tighten up his corners a bit and needs to shorten his corners. He needs to think more about mid-corner rotation rather than just initial turn-in. And I'm sure he's the last person in the world who would ever listen to any of my videos. So that doesn't seem to be happening at the moment, not relative to Oscar and how Oscar's doing that. Exactly what I've been saying Oscar is doing. Yeah. That's the point about Oscar. He's just incredibly natural feel. He's incredibly good.
Do you think?
No doubt about that.
He's very good, very, very good. Oscar. He's performed better than I had him down as performing. Do you think, though, to the Lando point? Do you think that the point of the short corners isn't necessarily one of his driving style or his competence, but that Lando's driving around the weaknesses of the car? Because that McLaren is still, they've come on leaps and bounds right as far as their development. But I think by all accounts, that McLaren is still a bit of a diva and needs to be driven in a certain way, hence why Danny Rick couldn't get his head around it. Do you think it's the car why Lando's driving that way, or just Lando's driving style inherent?
No, it's Lando's inherent style, for sure. Okay. You can drive well, i.e. the way Max drives, regardless of how good or bad the Formula One car is, that you drive the car well. I mean, that's the point. And I think Lando's always driven that way, and he's never known any other way to drive. And that's what he understands. That's his feel. It's a bit like Carlos Sainz. And he's not as extreme as Sainz in that respect, but that is the way he's always done it. So he would sense nothing wrong. All he would be saying is, I want a better front end, probably. Whereas I think Oscar would be saying, he'd be deferential and he'd be respectful and he'd say, yeah, of course I want a better front end. But privately, he'd probably be saying, front end's not that bad. I can live with that front end. Yeah. That's the difference. And I think that's the way it is. I don't go along with that business of the car didn't suit Daniel. I mean, what's that all about? Daniel didn't suit the car, I think, more to the point. And again, Daniel's kind of only ever driven one way, and he didn't change at all. Well, you shouldn't have to change. You just drive. The whole point about when I say short corners, it's a diminutive for a driver who is feeling the surface of the road all the time, who understands that to extend the straight into a corner and to lengthen the straight on the exit of the corner is going to be quicker than trying to make a long corner and get on the power as soon as possible and carry load through the corner for a longer period. But it does require incredible feel and touch in terms of when to rotate the car. Yeah. And that is a feel thing that you can only feel through the surface of the road and the tires and the surface of the road. And it's different every corner, every lap. The moment is different. It's not a fixed thing. Whereas a driver who has a more prescribed corner, a longer turn in, waiting to get on the power sooner, will basically drive that corner the same way every lap. Oh, there's a bit more oil this lap. Oh, a bit of a moment. Better back off next lap. Whereas the other driver is constantly feeling everything through the brakes, the steering, and the throttle. And he's making minute adjustments to what's going on corner by corner. And that's what Oscar does. He may make it look incredibly simple. And he may be very simple in his own approach to racing. But in terms of his footwork and his handwork, that's what he's doing. He's making very, very supple adjustments constantly.
Yeah.
As he's feeling where the moment is for the car to rotate. And that's what, I don't think Lando does that to that extreme.
Yeah. Jeez, Peter. Can we talk on the opposite end of competence? Can we talk about Checo Perez for a second as we round third base? Because I'm trying to understand, Peter, what's gone wrong with this fella, because it feels like Checo Perez is not Max Verstappen, as you asserted so succinctly earlier on. But the Checo Perez that I remember is a very good racing driver, but the moves that we saw, I mean, up the inside of K-Mag was like the clumsiest move that I've ever seen. What's going on with Checo Perez, Peter? Why is this chap not chewing his food before he swallows?
In my view, Cameron, when you say he's always been a very good racing driver, I think he's always been really good in defense, and there have been a number of great races he's put in which had immense pressure from behind, and he's managed to hold it off. And I think that comes under the heading of being a very good racing driver. He's a very good driver in defense. Personally, I've never seen him to be a great driver in attack. Never. I've never seen that side of Perez. Maybe I've had my eyes shut, but to me, that's never been one of his qualities. I've also said many times that I think he's got incredible feel for the exits of corners and applying traction and looking after the rear tires and managing the rear tires in acceleration zones. But that only applies on sort of 90-degree corners where it's all about traction and getting it right. Any corner that requires the car to be manipulated mid-corner with a difficult entry, which has got load against lateral load, braking load against lateral load, then he's kind of lost. And I like to think Red Bull kind of knew that when they hired him, because they thought, well, he's got plenty of shortcomings, but he is pretty good in a couple of areas, and he's the perfect number 2 to Max. And actually, he drove the perfect race, didn't he, at Suzuka? Because he just stayed out of trouble in the garage, didn't interfere with anything. And it was the perfect number 2 for Max Verstappen to go and clinch the Constructors' Championship. What more do you want? I mean, I think he was the perfect number. He's been the perfect number 2 all year, except for that period around Baku and Monaco when he got a bit feisty and, he got a bit too ambitious. And he quickly got over that. And now he's back to where he should be, being a good number 2 to Max. And that's fine. That's what they hired him to be. And Jeez. Of course, if Max was announcing that he was retiring at the end of this year, and Red Bull had already announced that Sergio Perez was the new number 1 at Red Bull, and they were going to put, I don't know, Lance Stroll in the other car next year, then you'd be worried if you were Red Bull. But right now, with Max being Max, why wouldn't you keep Sergio Perez? Where has he not done a great job as a number 2 for Red Bull? I think he's been brilliant, even when he's sitting in the garage doing nothing.
Jeez, Pete. Fair play, Peter. Okay, cool. As we round third base, you've been more than generous with your time. I just want to pitch this at you because on my podcast with the legends that are Shez and Baxty, our topic, that is one topic that we seem to broach every single week, and that's the FIA being consistently inconsistent. Talk to me about this penalty, Peter, and what you understand, because again, I'm trying to be as discerning as possible as I'm reading about Checo Perez's penalty. Is he able to absorb it as they unretire the car in the race at Suzuka, or will that carry forward through to the next race at Qatar? What needs to happen at the FIA, Peter? Because I feel like there's some issues unresolved from Abu Dhabi 21 as far as stewarding and race directorship. What in your opinion needs to happen there to solve for that?
Well, I'd like to say that more power should be given to the GPDA when it comes to sporting infringements on the racetrack. But I don't think I can say that because there'll be so many vested interests. I mean, on the one hand, you got Lewis Hamilton loving the purity of racing. On the other hand, he's wanting more DRS zones. I mean, why? Because the Merc's not very quick in a straight line, obviously. So there's so many vested interests.
Yeah.
The GPDA, well, yeah, okay, let's forget about that. The team owners, similar thing, take forever to make a decision. All right, we'll just leave it to the sports administrators, the FIA. And so they've come up with this punitive system of penalties and quite complicated application of penalties, which I suppose they feel is in concert with the way penalties have come into other sports as well. Personally, I don't really watch other sports apart from golf, and I'm not really aware of a lot of more penalties coming into golf, but I imagine there's more in football and rugby and all this other stuff. And to some extent, Formula One kind of copies everything that seems to be going on in football. So all this penalty stuff is part of Formula One keeping abreast with the other big sports of the world. I don't know. I mean, I was around at a time when Riccardo Patrese was the GPDA decided to penalize him after the Ronnie Peterson 78 Monza accident. And that was the GPDA. It wasn't the FIA. Wow. And it had an enormous impact on Riccardo as a racing driver. And actually, I think he came out the better for it. Because at the same time, he had quite a lot of the senior drivers, the James Hunts of this world, kind of talking to him in a way he understood. And it worked well. So I began this by saying I'd like to think that the GPDA should be given more power in the way that penalties are defined and applied. And so I finished by saying, well, wouldn't that be a good thing? I think that would be a good thing, actually. Leave it to the drivers more to decide that. That would be, I know it's never going to happen, but
Sadly.
that is because I think the FIA feel they need to be seen in this very strict school-like
draconian
atmosphere.
Almost, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but it's also we are in charge. You know, the discipline is ours. It's more that, I think. And is that cronyism? I don't know what that is. That's
draconianism.
Yeah, draconianism. And I think it's power, people, liking power, isn't it? And to be seen to be in power. And the problem you have is that the athletes obviously are responsible to the teams, and it's ultimately the teams that decide what happens next, vis-a-vis Abu Dhabi 2021 and Lewis Hamilton. As long as Mercedes were behind him, it was fine. But when Mercedes said, we're not going to fight this anymore, all Lewis could do was go along with it. So it is the teams, and it's a difficult thing because the teams work with the FIA in so many other ways, and there's so many quid pro quos that it's very difficult. Very difficult question you've asked, very difficult, complicated subject to which there is absolutely no answer, I'm afraid.
I think they've got to solve for it very quickly, Peter. I think they've had nearly 24 months now where it's been of no consequence, the bad decisions, right? Because you're not going to affect Max Verstappen's going to win irrespectively. But next year or the year after, at some point there was going to be a close championship again, right? And if these guys are still making these dodgy decisions, for want of a better term, I think there's going to be bringing the sport into disrepute is probably a bit too harsh of a term, but I think they need to sort it out in the off season, whether that's a restructuring of the way the rules and the sporting code of conduct are written, maybe more stewards and full-time consistent stewards. I don't know, but I feel like
I don't see that happening, Cameron, to be honest, because it's such a complicated sport in so many levels that even if you had a team of 20 full-time people, some of whom were stewards, some of whom were directors, whatever, I think they're all human beings, and they're all going to be subject, A, to making mistakes, and B, making decisions under pressure with so many different factions around them. That's what happened with Michael Massey, wasn't it? I mean, the case study really is Michael Massey, who's not an idiot at all, and did a very good job in a number of ways, and have had a very good CV coming into that job. And yet, under pressure at Abu Dhabi, the worst possible pressure you could possibly have, with Mercedes and Red Bull shouting in his headset, giving him the opposite advice, he ended up making the wrong decision. And that is always going to happen. That is always going to happen in Formula One, because there is no hard and fast rule. If you listen to Jonathan Wheatley 2 laps before the end of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, I didn't listen to him, but probably what he said made a lot of sense. And if you listen to Toto Wolff 2 laps before the end of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, what he said probably made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That is the problem with Formula One. It's so complicated. And there's so many grey areas because there's so much involved and so many people involved, so many clever people involved. So it isn't like, was the ball out or in?
Yeah, shades of grey.
Did this guy touch the ball? It isn't any of that. It's so much different stuff. It's beyond belief, really.
Shades of grey. Rock and a hard place for the stewards and the race director. Absolutely, Peter. Peter, you've been more than generous with your time. I'm going to just ask you a couple of questions from my subs who are super, super keen. First one from Elliot says, if you were hired as Mercedes TP with immediate effect, what would be your first 3 moves to get the team back on track?
Well, I'll pick up the phone to Adrian, first of all.
You were going to say
whether or not for 1 billion euros he might leave. And he would say no, I'm sure. The second one, there's a few engineers that I know I would bring in. You could say, the old guard. But I have a lot of respect for the old guard because it's the old guard that actually predicted all the porpoising that was going to happen in the 2022 cars, 21 cars, 22 cars. So there are some good old guard engineers I would bring in, none of whom are on Flavor of the Month lists at the moment. But I think they would be good at getting to the bottom of what Mercedes have been trying to do in the last 24 months. And just under that heading, a colleague of mine from the Williams days, who is very good, pretty much under the radar, not the sort of guy that you see on TV very often, has just been hired by one of Mercedes' rivals. Oh, wow. And I think he'll go really well, and I think he'll make a big change to what's going on. So I would say don't write off the old guard at all. And then thirdly, I wouldn't be able to do anything about the Lewis-George situation, but I would definitely try to understand exactly where Lewis is in his mind, what he wants from the car, what he wants from the team, what he thinks are the good and the bad points of the team. And I'd let the team become more Lewis orientated in the way I, as a team principal, would think, as distinct from this is the way it is, and Lewis will do that, and George will do it. I would try to I would respect Lewis's feel for Formula One and for motor racing in general. And obviously my job would be to keep George happy. And I would do that by saying, look, Lewis isn't going to be around forever, and just take the longer term view. But at the moment, this is where we're at. And we will support you in 100% the way we have. But ultimately, we need to keep this thing on an even keel. They're the 3 things I would do.
Wow. Love that. Fantastic answer, sir. Penultimately, Jacob says, will F1 ever return to classic tracks, or are we stuck with the new street circuits going forward? For example, it was a slap in the face to American motorsport fans when they decided to go to Vegas and Miami instead of Glen or Road America.
I don't think you're allowed to say that anymore, aren't you? I'm supposed to be saying Vegas is the greatest Grand Prix in the history of the universe. But good on you for saying that in the question. The problem is that it's an interesting problem, isn't it? Because I think going to street circuits and from day one has been one of the reasons that Formula E hasn't managed to gather the money and the momentum and the pace that it hoped it would have by now, because it's very expensive putting on street races. And I think Liberty, when they took over the sport, when they bought Formula One's commercial rights, thought, well, the way to do this is to, race in Miami, race in Vegas, race here, race, and all these city races, but they're very expensive and complicated things to do. Miami is kind of proving that a little bit. It's putting on a street race in the middle of Miami isn't as difficult, isn't as easy as everybody thought. And actually, it's not now in the middle of Miami. It's over there. It's at the Hard Rock Stadium, and it's quite difficult from a sponsorship point of view, getting guests from downtown, all the rest of it. And I gather there's quite a lot of logistic issue in Vegas as well. So the problem is I think Liberty believing, probably correctly, that Formula One's highest profile will best be achieved by having these very glamorous street races. And to the backdrop of, we've got some classic tracks that the drivers love and probably the Formula One fans love, and therefore even the Netflix viewers would love if the drivers love it. and the fact that those are also probably cheaper races to put on as well. So there is that sort of balance between the two sides of the business model. And we're settling down now into Liberty's ownership of Formula One. It'll be interesting to see where they go with that problem, whether they continue to put on races at expensive circuits and run the risk, I would suggest, I'm only suggesting, of having to underwrite some of those races if they don't make money. And because they want them in that glamorous location. But wow, it didn't work, but they want to keep it. Well, we don't have the money to put the race on. Okay, we'll help you a bit. And that's they can't do that forever either. So yeah, it's a difficult one, and it's. I would love to go back to the Glen. I mean, the odds of that happening for Formula One today, very small, sadly. Long Beach was a great Grand Prix as well. So yeah, some wonderful circuits in America, which we should be at, and we're not. Riverside, I think, is just a car park or a housing development these days, and Sebring's another good circuit, actually.
Yeah.
What's wrong with Sebring? Wide enough, lots of space. Bumpy, that's for sure, but Red Bull have to get their ride heights right there. That's no question about that.
Also, absolutely. And then finally, Peter, thank you for answering these. Jerry says, is the change in side pod concept helping tyre warm up for Mercedes, as that's been a problem historically? For the entirety of last season, they had to get an extra lap in to prepare for their tyres and aren't having to do so anymore. What do you reckon to that, Peter? Interesting technical question there.
Yeah, it hadn't occurred to me. I know they've had tyre warm-up problems. I've always put that down to their inability to manage the centre of pressure of the car and control it in a nice big sweet spot, as Red Bull do. And I'm not sure they've made any progress in that area. They've probably made a little bit. They've probably taken some inherent downforce out of the car and given themselves a slightly bigger sweet spot. But then since since Silverstone, we've had the stiffer tyres anyway. And I think that has changed the warm-up process quite a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, it is significant, and I don't think we should, hide from this anymore. But every time we run the hard compound in the new construction, McLaren fly. They're unbelievably quick. What does that mean? They get the hard compound to work better than anybody else. Put Red Bull to one side here, which must mean they must be generating more downforce, inherent downforce, than any other team. So McLaren's problem is always how to get that downforce out when they go to a medium fast or fast circuit.
Yeah.
And they're doing that quite well. I mean, Suzuka was always tailor-made for them because it was the hard compound and it's all about long corners. So what was the McLaren going to be? Full of downforce. And I think it's in those situations that Mercedes have difficulty getting the temperatures absolutely right and then sustaining those temperatures. But in my mind, it's not a question of the outlap. It's a question of how they manage the center of pressure and what the tire is, the heat cycle in the tire. It was pretty clear at Suzuka that it was one slow lap and then bang. I don't think Mercedes could have worked with two. Yeah, and I think that's changed. It's a good point. It's probably changed over the last 24 months. But then it shouldn't it? Mercedes should at least have found a little bit more downforce efficiently than where they started the year and 2 years ago. So yeah, I think that's happened. But that's not the issue. The real issue is that they don't have enough efficient downforce in the first place. And the downforce they have is in too smaller sweet spots, too difficult to control. And it changes according to fuel load and ambient and a lot of other factors as well.
Peter, nailed it. Thank you so much. But Peter, there's actually one question that I wanted to ask you. In research for a video, I saw you're going to have to rewind back to 2007. I was the video title was the 10 most controversial moments in F1 history. And I was looking at Hungary and Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton. When Fernando parks up in the pits and the person asking the questions post-qualification, their voice sounded very familiar, Peter. You asked Fernando, why was he stay? What was it, the team or was it him that was telling him to chill out? And obviously he answered it was the team. Interesting. I thought it was funny hearing your voice.
Well, that was about as accurate as when I asked Michael why he crashed at the Rascasse hairpin, and he said, "Oh yeah, I braked too late." Yeah, right. The trouble is with those things, you got the headset on and you've got the director in your ear saying, "Okay, move on, next driver," and you've got no time to say, "Come on, Fernando, give me a break." You can't do that in those what they call unilateral interviews back then. But that's what I would have said had I been given permission to do it. But yeah, that was ridiculous, and that's where the whole Pedro de la Rosa, Fernando Alonso thing began, wasn't it? Because it was Pedro that actually had the laptop with all the Ferrari stuff in it. And it was Pedro that said to Fernando, "You won't believe what I got here." And then Fernando realized that he'd got something that could be held against Ron. And therefore he had the audacity to do what he did in the pit lane. And then he went to Ron and said, "If you don't let me win tomorrow, I will show something to the FIA that will destroy McLaren." And when you think back now, and that Pedro Fernando axis is still in place at Aston Martin. It's interesting, isn't it? Nobody seems to be wondering about what's going to happen at Aston Martin. I mean, Lance Stroll hasn't exactly had a great run recently, has he?
Go on then, Peter. How do you think?
Well, I'm asking you, Cameron. I mean, how much of Lawrence Stroll's investment is based on making sure his son is in a Grand Prix car and B, doing well in the Grand Prix car? In other words, turning the question around the other way, if he's not in Formula One or he's not doing well, will Lawrence Stroll still be in Formula One spending money?
Brilliant question, Peter. I think the goalposts are moving by the second on that question. I think Lawrence, the man that I see Lawrence, and again, I don't know him personally, so this is from a distance and I'm speculating massively. I think Lawrence now might be more invested in Aston Martin than in Lance Stroll, as crazy as that sounds. And I think there's chatter of Lance not necessarily being, I don't think F1 was ever his dream. That was his dad's dream more than his, right? I mean, he's a tennis player fundamentally. And I suppose if he was the own author of his own future, maybe he would have been in there playing with the likes of Roger and Djokovic instead of
I doubt that, but anyway.
Instead of Alonso and Hamilton. I think they're going to have to do something about that because his underperformance, similar to Checo, his underperformance is now material. It was something in previous seasons, something that you could have overlooked, but now it's becoming an issue. And like you said about Mercedes, as they get more competitive, I only think that's going to get the variance between Alonso's performance and Lance's performance. It's going to be more material, right? I think he's going to have to do something about it forthwith. And he's got Drogovic just waiting in the wings, right? So it's going to be. I don't know, Peter. I feel like he's going to have to do something about it imminently.
But that's about the last thing they'll do, isn't it? I mean, what if Drogovic gets in the car? I mean, not that it'll ever happen because they can only ever run him on a Friday anyway.
Yeah.
But if he got in the car and he was back-to-back tyre compound for tyre compound, half a second quicker than Lance, what's the old man going to do then?
His hands are forced. He's got to make the switch.
Yeah, well, I don't think he would.
I don't think
he's in racing for any other reason that he believes his son is a potential world champion and wants to give him the best possible opportunity to win that world championship.
Wow.
That's what I think it is all about.
Peter, I suspect that has changed just because of his the cut of his jib, some of the sound bites. There's a very famous one when he was unveiling the car this year, right? When he says, "I get very passionate about things, and when I get passionate about things, I win," and that stuck with me. Was he talking about his son, or was he talking more about the team? And I think again, that's the goalposts are moving by the second, and that I think he's becoming more invested in the team than ever before. Not necessarily more than his son yet, but I think if we revisit this conversation in 24 months,
we'll see. I think obviously, if anybody ever asks him, or indeed any of within the team, everybody has to believe that is the case. But whether it's really the case is another matter. That's what I'm talking about, is the absolute reality of it all. And whether, because the problem is the pressure of having taken him out of a Williams drive that he was paying for and then buying a team in order to put him in because it was going to be much better than Williams. And now seeing Williams actually going pretty well. And on occasion, Logan Sargent doing a better job than Lance Stroll in the car that Stroll used to drive. it's an enormous pressure given the amount of money that has been spent and all the resources they have at Aston Martin. And as I said, the minute you start blaming molding a team around one person, i.e. the owner, it becomes a fragile business because Formula One is fragile. As we've seen, Lance Stroll can hurt himself as easily as any other driver. And
very nearly did last race.
Yeah, and what is the business plan there? That's the interesting one for me. Because there's no doubt, I mean, with that whole new factory, everything there's an incredible opportunity there for Aston Martin to do well. But how they've fallen off the boil is also a great subject of conversation, probably our next chat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like if Lance is the businessman that I think he is, he'll realise that he's now into as far as the amount of capital that is invested, the factory's not going anywhere, right? That's paid for 200 and something million. No longer is this just a Lance Stroll project. It's bigger, hence why I think 24 months from now, at the very latest, Lance probably won't be in that seat, as sad as it is. Sad as it is. But you speak about the pressure, right, Peter, and I think sometimes you've got to not put these drivers out their misery, but sometimes it's just not everybody can be a successful F1 driver, right? It's like the 0.1 of the 0.1. It's like maybe Lance isn't cut out for it, and I don't think his dad will hesitate to make a.
This is a guy that was on the front row at Monza in a Williams, and he's had a podium finish, I think, isn't he? So it's not exactly slow.
Yeah, he's not a bad driver, but again, sometimes things don't work out. Peter, you've been a legend, more than generous of your time. It's a privilege every time we get to chop it up with you about F1. It warms my heart. You're a legend, sir. Listen,
thanks, mate.
Peddlers, do me a favour, like, comment and subscribe to this channel, and then shortly thereafter get yourself over to Peter Windsor's YouTube channel and watch all of his streams, all of his videos. You will learn something. I'm telling you, the best F1 content and all of the YouTubes each and every single time. Thank you so much, Peter. You've been a legend. That's been another episode of the F1 Hour. Like, comment, subscribe. If you're listening on a podcasting platform, scroll to the top and leave 5 stars. You guys have been gold. Between now and next time, remember, as always, to look but never stare. Peace.